may or may not know that before this podcast, I hosted another one called STEM, Insider Tips for Greenhouse Pros. And although the technology was different, I was using an old school mic, Skype, used all sorts of file converting. The topics were important and the guests were top notch. I'm your host, Bill Calkins, and every couple weeks I'll jump back in time and re-release a STEM episode. In this Tech on Demand podcast Rewind, we're kicking off a two-part Rewind mini-series on poinsettias. You'll recognize the guests. First one is now retired Ball Seed Technical Manager Dr. Will Healy, who's going to tackle the early stages of poinsettia production in this episode, and then he hands it off to Dr. Todd Cavins to finish the crop in part 2. But that's enough out of me. Let's get into the episode. Will, welcome back to STEM.
Well, thanks a lot, Bill. Can you believe that we're coming around to Christmas time because it's poinsettia time?
It is, and it's funny. We've talked watering, we've talked mums. It seems like the watering topic was very broad and pretty much applied to every grower. Mums, again, a seasonal crop. A lot of greenhouses are producing mums, and I kind of feel the same way about poinsettias. There are many growers who grow poinsettias. They've grown them for years, but kind of like we talked about with mums, there are all sorts of new genetics out there, different strategies. You out there in the field are encountering different challenges each year. So I think that this is going to be an excellent conversation.
Yeah, and hopefully what we're trying to do with this particular two-part STEM presentation on poinsettias is help growers move from the common belief that they've been growing poinsettias for 26 years, which means that they've done 26 different poinsettia crops, to a person who basically can reproduce a top quality poinsettia 26 times in a row. Because you get one shot a year to do this, and let's try to figure out how can we be ensured that we've got a high quality product every single year, because we've got some very specific rules or some processes that we're going to implement and start. If you haven't done it yet, let's start thinking about it this time.
And it seems to me that poinsettias is one of those crops where you don't really have too much of a margin for error, margin being an economic term in this sense, because you really can't afford to throw away too many of those plants. So even though this is part one of a two-part episode, we're not actually going to start at the very beginning of the crop, receiving the liners, what to do at that stage. We're going to start a little bit further along after those poinsettias have been planted, most likely pinched, especially if you're growing a large crop, in terms of size. So you might ask why we're going to start in the middle, because as we've talked about, Will, this is really the stage that can make or break the final quality of the crop. So can you explain a little bit more fully why we chose to start a little bit further down the line versus right at the beginning of receiving that crop?
Well, basically, I think it's a time in a grower's production cycle where all of the attention is now focused on poinsettias. So it's actually a time when we can start taking and building some of the critical tools and techniques into finishing off a excellent crop. You've got about, if you're an early shipper, you're probably about 2 months out. If you're a little later shipper, within the next 3 months, this crop is going to be gone. So we really got the window of opportunity now to focus our attention on how do we grow a very consistent, high quality crop. Once we know these rules, and the nice thing about poinsettias is it's really easy to see the rules in action. Other crops it's a little harder, but these we're going to be able to really see the rules in action. Once you understand these rules, then you can then extrapolate it to earlier in the season to actually implement them earlier and even have further, better quality product.
And so to put everything into perspective, if you're listening in real time, you know the date. If you're not listening in real time, Will and I are actually speaking in, week 37 of 2019.
Right.
So if you're listening sometime in the future, just remember that Will and I are talking right now in week 37. So for part one of this two-part series, we want to focus on nutrition. And when it comes to poinsettia nutrition, it really, from what I understand, comes down to monitoring, especially with the pH and EC levels. So, Will, why is this monitoring so critical?
Well, Bill, just like when you're driving a car, you kind of need to have a real good idea of, where are you going? You need to have those rear view mirrors, those side mirrors. You need to have a lot of visibility of where you've been, where you're going, so you can understand what's happening with that when you're driving. Same with a crop. You really need to look at what is changing. And in this episode, we're really going to focus on the one component that makes or breaks the quality, the perceived value in the poinsettia crop. Over the years, I've only been growing poinsettias now, let's just call it 30 plus years, so I don't sound too old. But in those years, it's always rolled back to if you've got the nutrition right, if you've got the EC right, if you've got the pH right, insect and disease problems really are significantly reduced. 30 years ago, I started a program called Integrated Pest Management or Integrated Crop Management is what we looked at. And really, it got down to monitoring the pH and EC. Growers that did it, their problems seemed to go away. Whereas those growers that didn't, it really, they just started compounding their problem and it got worse and worse and worse. So what we want to do is we want to really monitor the pH and the EC. Simple things to do. It's not a complicated process, because what we know is that when you have an EC record over time of the crop, and usually a weekly test is more than enough, you can discern a lot of things that are happening inside the plant. For example, Bill, you're feeding the crop after you've stuck the cuttings and they're rooted, and before the pinch, you're feeding the plants because they're taking up the nutrition. So you're basically looking at the EC and you're asking yourself, am I putting on enough feed? Well, when you basically look at the testing, what it starts telling you is if the plants are taking up the EC, then obviously the EC of the fertilizer you're applying, there's not going to be any EC readings in the soil because the plant's going to take up everything that you put on. If the plants aren't growing, then obviously the EC you put on is going to be sitting there in the soil. So when you measure the soil, the EC levels go up. Does that make sense, Bill?
No, Ed, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So what you see then is that if you just feed the same 200, 250, or 300 parts per million nitrogen every single time you water, and then you monitor on a weekly basis, what you'll see is that as you come up after the pinch, the EC skyrockets. And why does this EC skyrocket? Well, there's a very good reason. The plant's not taking up any nutrients because it's basically stopped growing. You took out the growing point. Then when the plants go reproductive, the plants kind of stop. They think about what they're doing. They change from a vegetative to a reproductive state. And of course, at that point, they stop taking up any nutrients. So the EC again spikes. And then, of course, right as you come into the transition bract, as you're coming in the transition bract, the EC slowly starts climbing because the plants have pretty much taken up everything they need. And so it's just basically accumulating. Now, Bill, why is that important is really critical, is because as the EC comes up, you damage the roots. When you damage the roots, what you find is that you have more disease problems. So you end up with root rots, you end up with stressed plants, and stressed plants attract insects, so you end up with a lot more problems. So the smart way to do it is as you see the EC come up, then you cut back on the fertilizer you apply to better balance what the plant actually needs. So you might skip a feed as you go into a pinch. You might, as they go reproductive, either because you're pulling short days or we're getting to the critical photo period, that you basically start cutting back the feed until they start growing again, because you'll see suddenly that EC will drop in the soil because the plants are growing again. And then, of course, you taper back the EC as you come into the bract development, that early transition bract. So you can take the EC, monitor it over time, graph it on a piece of paper, And you can actually watch the ECs going up and down, and that helps you then decide, am I feeding enough or am I not? Am I putting the plant at risk or am I not? So it basically becomes a real nice guideline to help you decide, where am I, what am I doing, and what should I be doing more or less of. When you look at the pH, basically you can see the same thing, but the pH is basically going to move much slower, but it will indicate whether you've got enough limestone releasing in the soil to keep the pH where it needs to be. Because one of our biggest problems historically with poinsettias is that we've got bract necrosis or bract problems and botrytis sensitivity. And all the research has shown time and again that that's related to low calcium levels. So if your limestone isn't right, you're just not going to have the calcium levels. So you want to have the limestone is indicated by the pH. Make sure your pH is in that 5.862 range, and then you're good to go. So when you start looking at monitoring, you can tell a lot about the quality of the crop by just monitoring and recording what are your pHs and ECs.
I like the car analogy that you shared early on, and it strikes me that, like all greenhouse production, probably don't need a driverless car, because what we're looking here is very intricate, and there are a lot of nuances to the way these crops are produced. And you gave a really good overview of the importance of the pH and EC in nutrition, and we are going to dive a little bit deeper into those, especially with the feeding and short and long-term issues that we're going to worry about when we relate it to EC especially. Then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into pH as well here in a minute or two. But before we do that, can you take us back a step? You'd mentioned the importance of testing, and how should growers test poinsettia EC and pH?
Well, we've got to do this easy and efficiently. And I think that, Bill, you point out a good point about successful poinsettia growers walk their crop. Mm-hmm. They walk, they look and feel the crop and understand what's going on. So one of the tools that you can use in your toolbox to get your grower and get yourself out there is to basically say, we're going to go and collect a soil sample from about 10 plants or so every week. It forces you out through the block, makes you reach in, take a look, reaching in, and all of a sudden you get a ruffle of leaves and a cluster of whitefly looking like a snow blizzard coming at you. These are all good things to know. But so it does help you when you get out there and look through the crop. You don't have to make this complicated. What we're advocating is just a pH-EC. You take your pointer finger, stick it into the side of the pot because you want to get the soil where the roots are, because that's important, and just stick it in there as far as it'll go, and just pull a fingerful of soil up out of the edge of the pot. Throw it into some kind of, your coffee cup as you're walking down through the greenhouse. Preferably you drink the coffee first, but then about a coffee cup, and you go and you collect 5, maybe 10 samples until you've got about a half a cup of coffee of soil in your coffee cup. And then you add 2 parts of your clear water, no fertilizer in there, guys, and so that you've got a 2-to-1 measurement by volume. Stir it slightly and then let it sit for a while. Usually you let it sit for a minimum of a half hour, but if it sits, say you do this after break, and then you let them sit, and then after lunch, that's a nice time to actually go and measure it. And then you don't stir it again, you just let the solution that you're measuring, the solution, just so all the peat and everything settles down, and then you just stick your pH and EC probe in there and measure what is the EC and pH. How many different plants? If you've been doing stuff uniformly, you've got the same size pots, look at the whole block. That might be enough. If you've got a number of different size pots and a number of different ages and you probably want to look at each age of the crop, what the final planting date is, because they should all be on a different timeline. And if you have different size pots, you probably want to look at the different pots because they'll hold a different amount of nutrition. So those are, how many samples that you take. gaining the knowledge of what's going on out there will help you make good decisions. So that's basically, you don't have to do it very complicated. If you want to do full tissue tests and send off to soil tests, that's also, it's a good thing. Doing it once or twice is also very beneficial. And if it's a really, really good crop, you may want to go and test that, because that will help you understand when you have something that looks a little dodgy or doesn't look quite right, because then you can test when the plants don't look good, and then you've got a sample from your greenhouse that says, when they were perfect, these are my numbers. And then you can compare what was bad when those bad plants come along. So, full testing of soil and tissue, a good thing to do at least once, maybe twice in the season. But just pull a finger of soil out and measure it with your pH and EC meter. You should be doing that at least once a week.
Okay, and I love that piece of advice about taking a look at what these numbers look like with a good crop. I don't know that everybody thinks about that. You tend to start doing a lot of measuring when things aren't looking good, but to have a baseline to compare to when you have a really top-notch crop, I think is going to really be helpful in the future. Mm-hmm. So let's jump back right into the strategies, and I'm going to start by asking, what do you want to do or avoid in terms of feeding at this point? Because I know that what you're feeding with, how you're feeding, is going to impact the EC and pH, but I guess I'm not entirely sure how. But how does your feed decision impact EC or pH, and what should growers be doing at this point in terms of feed?
Okay, you have to sit down and start asking yourself, and this is a little bit of science here, but work on a number of crops has shown that the majority of the nitrogen, and that also indicates all the other nutrients, but the majority of the nitrogen that is present in the plant at the time of sale, so when they're fully flowered back, in another 2 to 3 months, is taken up by the plant before floral induction actually occurs. Because how plants take up nutrients is they basically move from the soil into the roots, from the roots into the older leaves, and then these are the nutrients that really we're concerned about. So it's nitrogen, it's magnesium, it's phosphorus. These nutrients move into the old foliage. They build up in the old foliage so that you start building up a reservoir of nutrients there, and then from the old foliage they're retranslocated into the developing foliage, going in the younger and younger foliage. So if you're running a deficiency in that old foliage, then guess what you're going to have in the young foliage bill? Don't have it in the plant in the old foliage, it's not going to be in the young foliage.
Right.
So it's important to feed aggressively early in the crop so that you can load the bottom leaves with the maximum amount of nutrition, so that later on it can translocate it into the developing plants. A lot of times we see growers that have all kinds of nutrient deficiencies as we wander forward in another 4 to 6 weeks, and they say, I've got magnesium, I've got phosphorus deficiency. Well, what should I do? And I always feel like, what you should have done is back in September, you should have made sure that you fed adequately to load those old leaves, because it's all you're seeing when you see deficiencies in late October and first part of November is the plant doing what it does. It moves nutrients from the old foliage into the young foliage. So obviously, if you don't have enough in the old foliage, it's going to be deficient. So let's make sure that we're getting enough fertilizer on the crop from the very beginning. So that's why we really want to make sure that we're getting the plants fed from day one. Some growers say, well, I'm not going to feed them because I don't want them to stretch. I don't want them to grow very much. Well, withholding feed is a bad strategy, because yes, you can turn them green. No question. Yes, you can make them look kind of good. Yeah, but if you really want to grow great, high-quality, consistent product that has great shelf life and good consumer post-harvest life, you got to feed it from the beginning, and then you can taper back later on in the crop and avoid high salts that leads to diseases, which leads to late season stretch, which leads to all kinds of late problems. Feed early and get those plants growing. So that's probably one of the first things. Now, of course, what you want to do is you want to feed so that you don't end up with high ECs in the soil. As we mentioned earlier, remember that the measurement of the EC in the soil is a measurement of what's left in the soil after the plant has taken up what it needs. So you put on, say, an EC of 2.5. You measure 0.5 1 day later. The plant has taken up the equivalent of 2 EC. So the plant takes it up and uses it. So you really want to be measuring that so that you're feeding aggressively, but you're also seeing that the ECs are staying low. If you put on 2 and the soil's 2, a day later, the plant hasn't taken up anything. Because did you know that, Bill, what we see in mini crops is that the EC is absorbed within about 4 to 12 hours after application. Did you know that?
Wow. No, I didn't know that. Wow.
So, the plants will take it up quite rapidly.
Quickly.
So if a day later, 2 days later, you still see EC in there, the plants are not taking up that feed. So high ECs are just going to lead to damaged roots. So this is why we want to make sure that we get a lot of feed on them to really start loading the plants early. And then we also need to remember that late in the crop, we need to start backing up because the plants don't need it because they're translocating it. So you really need to be thinking about, what is my parts per million that I'm applying? Now, one of the things that you do need to remember is that micronutrients, although low in volume per application, are important. You're not adding as much, you're not adding much. When the fertilizer manufacturers basically formulate a bag of fertilizer, they're assuming that you are applying 200 parts per million of nitrogen, and because you're doing that, you're also applying the appropriate amount of micronutrients that has been determined through good research. Now, Bill, if you go and only apply 100 parts per million nitrogen, this is a trick question, how much micronutrients are you putting on? Half as much?
Half, okay.
Because you're not putting 200, you're only putting 100. So you're putting half as much micronutrients on. So when you are putting less than 200 parts per million of a pre-mixed fertilizer, you better start trying to address what am I doing about my micronutrient package to make sure that I'm not running low on iron, manganese, boron. These are all critical nutrients. And of course, the all-time important one for poinsettias is molybdenum, MO, because it helps basically absorb the nitrogen and use the nitrogen within the plant. So growers that cut the feed levels down to 100 parts per million, they better be looking at, do we have a micronutrient package we can supplement that 100 parts per million so we have enough micros present when we're feeding the plant? Because otherwise we're going to run into molybdenum deficiency and other problems when we get later in the crop. So does that kind of sum up what we're looking for of what's one of our strategies or some of our strategies from generally feeding?
I think so, and then that is good to know that if you are cutting the feed from a nitrogen perspective, you can also add in those micros separately.
Right. And of course, if you're feeding 400 parts per million, you're putting on twice as much micros as you normally would, which might be okay, but also, just be aware of that you are putting on a lot of micros out there.
Okay. No, I think that's a good overview, and that makes a lot of sense. So you mentioned a little bit earlier that if the EC gets high or you're seeing it creep up, it will result in, I think you mentioned root damage and just general disease problems. Can you take a minute and go into a little bit more detail about what short-term and long-term issues to worry about if your EC is creeping up?
Well, okay, so if that EC starts creeping up, there is a point where it does become potentially lethal to the root systems, because you think about your root system, and a happy root is a fuzzy root. Okay, so what you have is you have all of these hair roots, which if you look at it, basically you pull the plant out of the pot, and what you look at your nice white roots, just back from the tip, you should see all kinds of fuzz. And this is good because that fuzz is basically root hairs, which increase the root water and nutrient absorbing surface area. And that increased absorption area basically spells good post-harvest life and good overall growth, because the more surface area, the more nutrients, the better the water uptake, the better the overall plant quality is going to be. If you have plants that have roots that are slick, there's no hair on them, those are called water roots, which tells you you've got reduced surface area, you've got reduced nutrient uptake, and also you potentially are not going to have the ability to take up as much water, so your post-harvest life of that plant is also going to suffer. So we really want to be focusing on that. Well, what happens when the EC starts going up? Well, those little hair roots get dried out really fast. If you made it through your chemistry class, which a lot of us barely did, but if you made it through your chemistry class, you remember something about osmotic gradients, where the water moves from a high salt place to a low salt. No, I think we got that backwards. It goes from a low salt to a high salt is the way the water, because it goes to try to dilute it. Right, Bill?
I think so.
Just checking to see if you were listening. So if you got high salts out there in the soil, and it basically sucks the water out of those hair roots, and they die. So if your salts get too high, and by too high, on a 2 to 1, you start looking at 1.5 is okay, 2 gets to be a problem, 2.5 gets to be a serious problem, 3, that gets to be really, really problematic. And then if the soil dries, the salts effectively become more concentrated in the soil, and they dry them out even faster. So you really want to make sure that your salt levels are hanging right around, 1 is a happy place. Nobody died at 1 when using a 2 to 1. So you kind of want to make sure that your soil salinity levels, the EC levels, stay right around 1.
Okay, and I think, when you said what you said a little bit earlier, I think is something that's worth repeating at this point, is that it's these root hairs and the fuzzy roots that actually do result in the best post-harvest condition for that plant. And especially with poinsettias, that's really what we need, is for these to look fantastic at retail and to perform well for the end customer. So those root hairs and the way that the health of the plant at this stage is really going to be critical on down the line.
Yeah, because if you really sit down and look at the torturous route and experience that our plants have between the time they leave your greenhouse bench and get a sleeve wrapped up around them until they get to the consumer's home, where they are unwrapping that particular pot and then able to rewater it, there's a lot of bad things that happen as far as temperature and drying, and you want a very vigorous, branched, hairy root system that will be able to tolerate those kind of stress conditions, that they can find water and survive. So that's really important, to basically have a good solid root system so that you can be successful at the consumer's post-harvest experience.
So let's jump into pH a little bit. You mentioned the optimal range is 5.8 to 6.2. What exactly is gained by keeping the pH in this range specific to your poinsettia crop?
Well, all of the nutrients, specifically the micronutrients, availability at the root system to be taken up, are all pH dependent. So when the pH is in this range, you end up with your maximum nutrient uptake for just about all of the nutrients, and micronutrients and macronutrients. As the pH starts dropping below that, well, certain nutrients become really available. One of the we see many times is when the pH drops, iron becomes really available, whether it's applied or not. There's a lot of iron floating around that's in the soil that's bound, and suddenly what you end up with is iron toxicity. If, on the other hand, the pH rises too high, you start getting at 6.5, 6.8, and even higher, you start running into problems with iron is not available because it's all bound up onto the soil, so you end up with iron deficiencies. So iron is kind of the one everyone looks at, but the reality is that same kind of availability problem occurs with manganese, Mn, with magnesium, Mg, and also your calcium is availability, and your potassium uptake. They're all pH sensitive. So the happy place is this 5.862. And if you're using fertilizers, that should be more than sufficient to manage it. If you have to go using, you've got very high alkalinity water, as some growers will see, and you have to go in there and start using additional, say, sulfuric acid to lower the alkalinity and the pH of the water. You just have to be aware of the fact that monitor that carefully so that you don't push the pH too low, or you basically fail to apply the right amount of acid and the pH climbs too high. So pH monitoring is important, and it's less critical than EC, but it's also very critical for the uptake of those nutrients that are in the soil.
Okay, which again will kind of are the building blocks for having that healthy plant.
Yep.
That you're sending to market. So what about fertilizer formulation? You mentioned a couple minutes ago that at some point the type of fertilizer used on that poinsettia crop changes, right? So I guess I'm going to ask you just to get a little bit more specific about that, what to do and why when it comes to fertilizer formulation.
Well, the interesting thing about poinsettias, and this is where my lead-in comment was, learning the role of fertilization on plant aesthetics. How does the plant look? How does the plant perform? It's really neat to do it with poinsettias because they are probably the single most responsive plant that we have, that you can actually see the response in the plant. So let's kind of walk through this so that you can start understanding what response is caused by different fertilizers. So when you take a look at your fertilizer bag, and you see 20, 10, 20 or 15, 5, 15 or whatever, and you look down into the label, they'll basically, they'll have nitrogen 15, but they'll tell you right below that, where do the nitrogen sources come, what are the nitrogen sources? Is it due to ammonia sulfate, ammonia nitrate, ammonium phosphate? Is it their ammonia form in there? Is urea, which is an ammonia form? And they'll tell you what percent of that 50, say if it's a 20, 10, 20, what percent of that 20% is in the ammoniacal form? How much ammonia is coming, how much nitrogen is coming from ammonia? Then they'll also indicate that they basically supplied nitrate from calcium nitrate, potassium nitrate, magnesium nitrate, so that you can actually read how much of the nitrogen is in the ammonia form versus the nitrate form. This is the most critical information that you as a grower need to know when you're looking at poinsettia growth. Why is that important? Is because we know from way more experience than we should have that the combination of ammonia plus phosphorus does two things. One, everyone understands ammonia plus phosphorus causes internode stretch, or basically makes the plants tall. We also know that ammonia plus phosphorus makes the leaves really big. So if you want really big leaves, and we'll talk a little bit more about, how do you define what is a big leaf? But if you want really big leaves, you feed them with a lot of ammonium phosphorus. So if you have a 20, 10, 20, the second number being 10, and that means that, there's a lot of phosphorus in 10. 20, 10, 20 at 200 parts per million basically will provide about 40 parts per million phosphorus. 40 parts per million phosphorus is a lot of phosphorus. Less than 10 parts per million phosphorus is not very much phosphorus. So you need to basically look at between 10 to 15, 20% phosphorus if you're trying to get nice sized leaves. But if you want really jumbo leaves, 20, 20, 20. Downside of that is you get really tall plants because of the phosphorus and ammonia causing stretch. But then you also have really big leaves, like dinner plate size leaves. So if that's the look and feel that you want, then that's the fertilizer you need to use. Of course, for every yang, there's a yin, and the opposite side of the ammonia is lack of ammonia. So if you use 15015, for example, notice there's no phosphorus in there. Awesome. The 15015 does have a little bit of ammonia in there, just so that you don't end up with the bag of fertilizer turning into a giant rock, so it doesn't basically cake on you. But it's primarily nitrate, calcium, potassium, magnesium nitrate. So you've got a nitrate-based fertilizer. And so you have very little or no ammonia in there. So consequently, if you want to keep really tiny leaves, what do you feed with? You basically feed with an ammonia, low ammonia or no ammonia based fertilizer. So read the label and see what percentage of the total nitrogen is in the ammoniacal form, and that will start telling you very quickly, is this particular fertilizer going to give me big leaves and a lot of stretch, tall plants, or is it going to give me small leaves and more compact plants? So, this fertilizer decision, what is the formulation of that bag, will help you determine what end picture do I need? What end picture am I going to end up looking? Do I want to have a plant that has small leaves on the bottom and big leaves on top? What happens to that plant, Bill, when you start doing stuff like that, where you put all the leaves at the big leaves on the top?
It's going to fall right over.
Yeah. You basically, if you suffer from breaking branches, you probably have got your nitrogen backwards, because you're basically pumping it with ammonia and phosphorus, which of course is going to yield big leaves. Mm-hmm. Big leaves weigh more than little leaves. And so if you put all the big leaves at the top, you're top heavy and you fall over. Basically, the branches break off. Conversely, if you feed heavily with ammonia early, you're going to end up with big leaves on the bottom of the plant, so that when it's sitting on a table, you don't have to look at the person across the table from you, because you've got all of this foliage sitting right at the top of the pot. So you can actually customize the look of your plant. And, impressions of what your plants look like are how consumers determine quality or no quality. If it's top heavy, consumers look at those and say, is that as good a quality as where you have the big leaves on the bottom right across the top of the pot? And then that basically gives you a much better quality appearance, because it's got more mass at the bottom. Because that's really the differentiator on poinsettias. Two pots next to each other. One of them's got leaves at the bottom. One of them's got all the leaves at the top. See which one sells better.
Right. And I've heard you say, you want to shoot for that almost a pyramid structure. Yes. Of the plant, where you've got those big leaves and all those good breaks down toward the bottom, and then you're toning it with the smaller leaves going up to the top, which creates that sort of pyramid shape that is going to look nice at retail. It's going to look nice sitting on that dining room table. It's going to look nice when you give it to grandma at Christmas time. It's just a better plant. So okay, I think that's a good overview of sort of the formulation and how to apply it, and when to when to dial back on one type, going for those smaller leaves. So what are the signs to look for when you're trying to decide if you're using too much or too little ammonia or phosphorus? I know that I've heard you talk about, and I'm still trying to get my sort of head around this hand or fingers strategy to measure the plant leaf, but can you share, I guess, with the listeners a little bit about that, because it is a pretty easy way to get a handle on how your crop's doing, and then maybe what to look for when you're making that decision to dial back on the ammonia or phosphorus.
Yeah, basically what we do is we do the finger test. How many fingers does it take to cover the width of the leaf? So you look at a recently fully expanded leaf. So it's not the leaf that's coming straight up. It's not the leaf that's kind of coming down, but it's probably about the third or the fourth leaf from the top. And you look at that leaf, because that's pretty much as big as the leaves are going to get. So what you look at is you basically take your hand and you set it on top of the leaf. And of course, then you basically look at it, the bulk of the leaf is covered by two fingers, That's a tiny leaf. 3 fingers, that's a nice sized leaf. You're kind of in the right ballpark. 4 fingers, well, if you're on the bottom of the plant, if you're measuring, say, one of the bottom leaves that's sitting right at the top of the pot, 4-finger leaf at the bottom, awesome. 5-finger leaf on the bottom, that's pretty darn big. So because you got that, unless you've got a really big hunker plant, you're starting to look at, you've got plants that need to be, 24, 26 inches tall, and they've got to be, you've got them in a 10, 12-inch pot. Yeah, you probably want to get, some pretty good-sized leaves to get things some mass. What you want to do is you want to go and just kind of do a finger test, and as soon as that middle age leaf, because most poinsettias have about 7 to 9 leaves from the break to the transition leaf. So from where it comes off of the cutting up to the transition, you need a minimum of 7, but you need 9 or more. So you probably are looking at the leaf, if you're counting from the bottom, about the leaf 4 or 5 coming from the bottom. Having a leaf in there right around 3-4 fingers, that's probably okay. But if you start moving to leaves even higher, that there's still 4 or 5, you've got too much ammonia in the crop. If you go and look at your poinsettias today, and you probably have pinched them, they've already started growing out, you probably have got some fully expanded leaves on the bottom, and you go and you start measuring those with your fingers, and you've got 1-finger leaf, which that bottom leaf that's right by the cutting where its first leaf that unfolded, it's 1-finger leaf. You didn't put enough ammonia on the crop early to get that leaf to expand. If you find that first leaf is like 2 or 3, you're starting to get in the ballpark of having fed the cutting, the liner sufficiently so that when you pinched it, you actually had some nice leaf size. So it's, I think, a nice and easy way to go and start as a manager walking around and, laying your fingers down on the leaves and kind of saying, yeah, I think we're at the right amount of ammonia, or, well, maybe we can cut back the ammonia, or maybe we should add a little bit more to get our leaf size a little bit bigger, because the leaf size, the width of the leaf, gives you the bulk of the plants, gives you the filler, makes the plants look quality. If you got all these 2-finger leaves, they're going to look a little wimpy and look a little thin. These are all words. If you can, and usually then you end up with a 2-finger leaf. You end up with a lot of seeing stems, which then also perceived as low quality. So you can use this
what you end up with is a bunch of poinsettias sitting on the bench at the end of the season.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, that's good, and it makes a lot more sense to me now hearing you explain it that way. How many growers do you think are actually kind of using that or a similar method? I mean, when you go and work with growers, how many folks are kind of actively walking the crops and thinking about them that way?
I would say that top that I learned this, of course, many years ago from a grower who was produced probably the finest quality that you've ever seen. Consistently, year in, year out. He grew the same crop 26 times in a row. He didn't grow 26 different crops. It's because he basically dialed in, we need to have this much ammonia. How do I know if I've got enough ammonia? I go and put my fingers on them, and I can tell. So not a lot of growers are doing it, but it's a technique that really top growers are doing. And I think that we have to learn from the top growers, because you only get one shot a year, so you better go listen to the people who do it and find out, how do they do this? How do they make that judgment call? Because soil testing isn't going to tell you how much ammonia is in the plant, because tissue tests tell you total nitrogen. Fun fact, useless information. You need to know how much ammonia has gotten in that plant. Did the ammonia respond? Did it cause the plants to stretch? And the interesting thing, and we're going to pretty much talk about that in the next podcast, is the whole question of how do you control stretch? How do you control those inner nodes? Well, if all of a sudden you've got, Bill, nothing but 4 and 5-finger leaves, how much growth regulator do you think you should use?
Right. Well, you're going to need more.
Yeah, a lot more. And so those plants are going to stretch. And of course, if you're sitting there with a speck of a 20-inch poinsettia and you're sitting at 14 inches and you've got a bunch of 2-finger leaves, what do you think one course of action might be to get them to stretch? Put on some ammonium nitrate.
Feed.
Yeah, ammonium and phosphorus, because feeding with nitrate is probably how you got there. Feeding with ammonium and phosphorus probably is going to get you to where you need to be, because it'll help stretch them. Now it'll blow up the leaves, but it will help you stretch. So, you can use this technique to help guide you to fine-tune that last quality question of, am I where I need to be, or do I need to change what I'm doing?
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks for jumping into that a little bit. So before we wrap up here, I know that we've talked a lot about watering and different watering strategies, the importances of watering levels, and I know that poinsettias probably do have some nuances when it comes to watering. There's probably some general watering guidelines to follow. Can you remind listeners just a little bit about some best practices specific to watering their poinsettia crop?
Sure. We have to remember that, there are levels, 1 through 5, and we've got the watering that basically tells you how you can determine what your measurement is, 1 to 5. And, but you can use the same concept that, in a measurement, you want to go from a level 4 to a level water up to a 4, which we all know is basically a drip out of the bottom of the pot. That's a good indication that you're at a level 4. Water running out of the bottom pot is basically telling you you're at a level 5. So what you want to be doing is you want to be getting there to get a drip out of the bottom, and that'll take you to a 4, and then you want to take it back down to a level 2. So in a level 2 basically means that the top is probably tanning and the bottom of the pot still is still moist. And what that'll do is that'll help drive the roots from the top to the bottom. Now, if you want it, and that's qualitative measurement, so you visually see what it is. Now, if you wanted to go and put a weight to that, you can, and we do that on some of our production where we take large pots and we do weigh them. And what we're doing is we're saying, okay, when they hit the dry spot, that's the weight. And of course, we've got plant material on there that's a lot of weight of the plant, but it'll basically tell you that, okay, so we dried it down to the point where we believe, and we record that weight. Then we go and we add it up till you get to the drip, and that basically tells you, okay, we've added 300 grams of water to take it from the dry point to the wet point. So that's 300 grams of water. So if we put on 300 grams of water, we have to now get rid of 300 grams of water. So by then measuring it, you can then make a decision that, okay, so tomorrow I come back in and I realize I've only lost 100 grams. Okay, I shouldn't water.
Right, don't water it that day.
Don't water. So then on Wednesday I come in and I lose another 150 grams. So now I've lost 250 of that 300 grams. Water, don't water. And so then I can kind of look at this and go, yeah, I should probably water. What this does is it helps discipline the grower, especially early in the crop when it's most critical to get this wet-dry cycling to force the roots to the bottom of the container and really get the branching and get the whole rooting process started. It helps force the grower to be trained not to water, because remember, we mistrain our growers. We train our growers and say, your job is to water. So to do a good job, what do, Bill?
They go out and water.
Right. Whether it needs it or not, by God, they're going to water. So what you want to be able to do is we really should be training our growers to dry the plants out. Every time you hit the dry target, we're going to pay you. It'll completely change your whole philosophy, because guess what they're going to do? Are they going to water, or are they going to try to figure out how to dry them out?
They're going to pay close attention to how to dry that crop out.
Right. So what that does is it changes the dynamic of what you're driving them, because you really want the crops to dry out. Drying them out basically increases branching, plants looking for water, increasing fuzzy roots, increasing the search for water and nutrients, so that you end up with a higher quality plant when you have a plant that basically goes through a 4 down to a 2 on a regular cycling basis. Focusing on early crop development through the next, say, 15, 20 days is probably the most critical time of the life of the plant, because that up through about October 1st, when you are trying to decide to short days, or you're basically going through natural short days, this is a very critical time of the crop for having a strong root system, because it's only going to get murkier and darker and more miserable growing conditions, except in the southern hemisphere, from this point on. So
Great.
Really focus on your roots right now.
And I'll go back in the show notes and link to those episodes on watering. They are two of our most popular episodes we've ever done on STEM, but I know that there are still plenty of people who need to listen and share those with their team, because the watering levels is such a great way to keep everybody on the same page. And again, it pertains very much to a poinsettia crop. So, Will, as I mentioned a few times, this is part one of a two-parter, and we'll be back in a couple weeks with part two. So what should listeners expect to learn in part two?
Well, part two, we're really going to focus on monitoring, because, if you think about success, it's about, if you measure it, you can change it, you can manage it. So you really want to be monitoring your crop to manage it correctly. So we're really going to talk about monitoring for height control. A critical part of hitting the market requirements is having plants that are tall enough. And it's not just how you monitor it, it's, okay, now that you've got the data, what are you going to do about it? So we'll talk a little bit about, what do you do if you're too tall? What do you do if you're too small? What do you do if you're not in the right place that you should be? So we're going to talk about that whole monitoring. Todd Cavins is going to be covering that. So we'll be able to have a good discussion on monitoring and using the different tools that you have available. Also, insect control. Monitoring your insect control, is really critical to understand, where is the pest, how is it increasing, decreasing, so that you can basically understand where you are and why you are failing. What is the three-legged stool of success for a insect control program? So, because it's usually one of the legs is broken, and that's why you're failing. So, we're going to talk about that. So it's not just the monitoring, but what do you do with it once you've got the data?
Great. So we're going to have good practical information like we did this episode. So, Will, thank you so much for sharing so much information. I know that Ball Seed has a ton of resources available for poinsettia growers, and I'm going to include a lot of links in the show notes, both from Ball Seed and from Select North America, which is a partner company that offers some of the best poinsettia genetics available today. But Will, as always, thank you so much for your time and expertise. And like you mentioned, we're going to be back in a couple weeks with Dr. Todd Cavins, who's going to jump in and take on part two of this poinsettia series. And I'm excited to hear from him as well. So, Will, thank you very, very much.
Good. And happy poinsettia growing.